World War II wasn't just Germany versus the Soviet Union. It was almost all of Europe against one country. Over 400 million Europeans faced the USSR's 190 million people. Yet the Red Army not only held the line, they pushed back. How did a smaller nation overcome nearly an entire continent? Before we dive deep into this unbelievable story of courage, endurance, and sacrifice, please take a moment to subscribe and like this video. It really helps us keep sharing true stories that go beyond textbooks. Because history isn't just about numbers. It's about the people who lived, fought, and never gave up. By the summer of 1941, Europe was under the shadow of the swastika. From France to Norway, from Greece to Poland, most of the continent either bowed to or joined Nazi Germany. Hitler's armies were not just German. They were a European coalition united under his banner. Romania, Hungary, Italy, Slovakia, Finland, and even volunteer divisions from France, Spain, and the Netherlands all contributed men, machines, and resources to the war against the Soviet Union. Altogether, these nations represented over 400 million people, a staggering population base for war production and military manpower. And against them stood the USSR, with just 190 million people, a nation still healing from civil war, purges, and famine. Yet within that nation lived a fire, a belief that they were fighting for their very existence. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, it wasn't just another invasion. It was the largest military operation in human history. More than 3 million Axis troops surged into Soviet territory, supported by 600,000 vehicles and 750,000 horses. The world watched, expecting the Soviet Union to collapse in weeks. But that collapse never came. The Red Army was unprepared, under-equipped, and disorganized. In the first months, entire Soviet armies were surrounded and destroyed. Millions of soldiers were captured. Yet even as cities burned and soldiers starved, the resistance did not die. It grew stronger. Behind every retreating unit there were workers, farmers, and students digging trenches, building defenses, and arming themselves with whatever they could find. Factories were dismantled piece by piece and moved thousands of kilometers east, beyond the reach of German bombers. Within months, tanks and aircraft were rolling off new assembly lines deep inside the Urals and Siberia. By 1942, the Red Army began to transform, learning, adapting, and striking back. And then came Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad wasn't just a fight for a city, it was a fight for the soul of a nation. Hitler's best armies faced ordinary Soviet soldiers, many barely adults. They fought house to house, room to room. The city became a graveyard of steel and ash. By the time it ended in February 1943, the once invincible German Sixth Army, 300,000 strong, was gone. Over 90,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner, including generals and officers, only. 5,000 would ever return home. Victory broke the myth of Nazi invincibility and, more importantly, it gave hope to a world that had nearly lost it. War is not measured only by victories, but by lives lost. For every meter of land reclaimed, the USSR paid in blood. Entire generations vanished in smoke and snow. By the end of the war, an estimated 27 million Soviet citizens were dead. Cities were flattened. Villages erased. Families destroyed. But behind those numbers were stories of unfathomable courage. The nurse who ran into burning rubble to save a wounded man. The mother who hid her children during bombings and then joined the partisans. The pilot who, out of ammunition, rammed his aircraft into an enemy bomber to save his comrades. These weren't just soldiers. They were people who decided that surrender was not an option. By 1945, the tables had turned completely. The Red Army was no longer defending. It was advancing. From Stalingrad to Kursk, from Belarus to Berlin, the push never stopped. And when the final reckoning came, the scale of Soviet victory shocked the world. According to official Soviet records, the Red Army had taken 1,047,593 German and Austrian prisoners. Nearly 2 million men of the once dominant Axis force were captured on the Eastern Front alone. And that doesn't include Romanians, Hungarians, Italians, or Finns, hundreds of thousands more who surrendered in those brutal final months. It was not just a military triumph, it was the triumph of endurance, unity, and sheer willpower. It's easy to think of World War II as Germany's war, but in truth, it was Europe's war against the USSR. Romania sent over 600,000 soldiers, Hungary around 200,000, Finland nearly 500,000, and Italy tens of thousands more. Even Spain, though officially neutral, contributed the Blue Division, volunteers who fought fiercely at Leningrad. Many of these men believed they were fighting against communism for the defense of Europe. But what they didn't realize was that they were feeding a machine of conquest. And in the end, that machine turned against them all. When the Red Army entered Berlin in May 1945, it was not just a victory over Germany, it was a victory over an entire European coalition that had once seemed unstoppable. So, how did 190 million people stand against more than 400 million? The answer isn't just numbers, it's spirit. The Soviet people believed the war wasn't about politics, it was about survival. For them, defeat meant extinction. Every soldier who fought on the front lines knew that behind him stood his family, his village, his country, and that there was nowhere left to run. There was also an extraordinary unity between civilians and soldiers. While men fought, women built tanks, flew aircraft, and worked in fields under constant threat. Children collected metal scraps and knitted socks for the front. The entire nation moved as one giant heart, beating only for victory. History often celebrates the victors, but rarely understands their pain. The Soviet victory in World War II wasn't about ideology. It was about survival, about choosing life over darkness. When we look back, we must remember that behind every number is a face, the young German who never came home, the Russian mother who never saw her son again, the millions of civilians who had no say, yet paid the highest price. It reminds us that wars are never glorious, they are only tragic lessons written in blood. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world stood in ruins. But from that ruin rose an undeniable truth. The strength of the human spirit has no limit. The Soviet Union, battered and broken, had done the impossible. Against overwhelming odds, they endured, fought back, and ultimately liberated half of Europe from the grip of fascism. So when we read that 593 German and Austrian soldiers were captured by the Red Army, we must remember it wasn't just a statistic. It was proof of what determination, unity, and sacrifice can achieve. If you've watched till here, thank you. History is not just a collection of old stories. It's the memory of what we once endured, and a warning of what we must never repeat. Honor the past, cherish peace, and remember, courage often blooms in the darkest hours.